Hey friends. I had a great conversation yesterday with my wife, and it was sort of following on from where I left things in my post yesterday. Um, I've talked about what I feel like is a kind of transitional phase for me, and a period of creative movement that's very encouraging to see things showing up in my life that I really want to be diving into that inspire me. And yesterday in particular, I talked about how there's been a almost like a backlash. You know how when you're going through a transition in life, a lot of times, especially if it's one that um, feels like it's been a long time coming, or there's been some resistance to going through the transition, then there can be a kind of a once things start to move, there can be a kind of a backlash, and we feel the resistance all of a sudden very palpably of elements that may have been part of us and may have been active in us for quite some time, but because we weren't really moving, they didn't have a chance to express themselves that much, or they were expressing themselves by just keeping things from moving. Then when movement happens, everything gets activated and things can kind of flare up. I talked about that a little bit yesterday. Um, and in the conversation that I had subsequently, I have observed something, or I was something was reflected to me by my amazing wife, who is like a shaman at this stuff, which is that I have always been somebody who's kind of independent and very self. I've oriented most of what I've done around my own inspiration, creating something on my own, creating something for myself. At least that's how I've thought of myself and imagined what I do. Often, in contrast to that, some of my favorite work projects and favorite contexts for expressing myself have come when I've actually been in an institution where I was a good fit, or a member of even just a small team where I had a very specific role. So, in other words, the boundaries, the container of whether it's an institution or a project itself, just a one-off creative project can be a container. Um, and I've had any number of projects where it's like they have given me a definition. They've given me a purpose and a function and a goal, and man, do I go for it usually when I'm in situations like that. And so this idea that, like, what the way I am most expressed, or the way that will lead to my greatest satisfaction, that somehow has to be entirely based on something that I'm creating from within my own mind, or within my own control, is questionable. It's worth questioning that approach. And and it's some. Oh, my daughter's waking up. I let her sleep this morning instead of getting her up for music practice because she only has a half day. We can do it later. Um, but anyway, I found myself kind of going, huh? How did I not? Why is this? Because it was a real insight, and it was something that, again, my wife reflected to me. She sort of pointed this out, and we were both kind of like exploring what that means. But it really kind of perked me up a little bit, and I was like, oh, maybe I've been going about this all wrong. Maybe some of those limitations that I've been resisting in the form of institutional involvement, or connecting with groups, connecting with places where I would have a very specific kind of role. And I have felt resistance to that. I have felt myself kind of balk at those opportunities sometimes. But maybe that's not serving me. That's what showed up today. Maybe there's a kind of maybe there's a particular kind of limitation that actually, rather than being a limitation in the negative sense, in other words, a sort of like restriction around my expression, maybe a container. The container is a good word because it implies a boundary, but it doesn't imply a restrictive boundary. But a container is, and finding the right container could actually be my goal, or actually be something that I at least experiment with. That could be very helpful. And I know other people have had this experience. I've had this conversation before with other friends of mine, folks who are kind of in the field, or in maybe not even in the same creative field, but have a kind of similar approach to life. And there's this imperative in some ways that we self-author our own expression, and that's wonderful, and it's great, and it's a real it's very empowering to embrace that, and to know that is what we're capable of, and to claim that. But that doesn't have to be diminished by joining an institution, or becoming part of a group, or joining forces and creating collaboration, finding ourselves in collaboration. Even just talking to a collaborator is a limitation in some way, because not in the negative sense, but it creates a reflection surface, and it creates a reference point outside of ourselves. I mean, I always think back, whenever I go to this way of thinking, I always think back to when I read Soren Kierkegaard in philosophy class in college, and he talked about the dichotomy, or the polarity, between freedom and necessity. And freedom, on the one hand, is freedom. It's openness, it's possibility, it's vast potential. Necessity is restriction, limitation, definition, contour, shape, context. This is where we really are. And obviously we can, and what he taught, the thing he points out is that we can suffer an overabundance of either one of these. We can suffer too much freedom, or we can suffer too much necessity. It's not, in our sort of individualistic American culture, we tend to think, well, necessity is bad. Any kind of limitation is like, we just generally, the connotation is restriction, limitation, suppression, restrictive of our freedom. And freedom is like, freedom, how could there be anything wrong with freedom? But what Kierkegaard points out is, depending on who we are and where we are and what our opportunities actually are and what our context is and what our needs are, we can suffer on either side of that, and neither of those suffering either of these is sort of equally miserable. We don't want to be there. We want to be it's a polarity, right? We want to be wherever on that spectrum is optimally helps us express, contribute, and grow. So that's kind of what showed up for me today. Interesting thoughts to ponder as this threshold kind of unfolds. So we'll see what my daughter's getting up to. She has not left her room. Usually she pops right out. Thanks for watching, folks. I appreciate you. Have a wonderful day. I'll see you soon.